So I'll be talking a little bit about something called sacred values and devoted actors. So we've probably all heard of rational actor models and rational choice theory, especially instrumental ones, the idea that people evaluate decisions by weighing costs and benefits. And this is basically an underlying assumption around a lot of policy, not only CVE and CT policy, but even economic theory, criminology. The idea is if you can get the balance of carrots and sticks right, you can pretty much get anybody to do anything you want them to do, essentially. It's the idea behind things like sanctions and foreign aid. Sanctions being the sticks and foreign aid being the carrots. You kind of get the right balance, and all of a sudden you can avoid war, you can bring about peace, etc. And it's an implicit model that's very influential in policy and even scientific thinking. Of course, we know that humans are a little bit more complicated than that. If it was true that just carrots and sticks could always make peace, then we would expect to see a lot of peace out there in the world, and it doesn't always work. In fact, it especially doesn't work when you're dealing with members of terrorist groups or insurgency groups, where you have people who are willing to give their lives for their beliefs, essentially. There's no cost they're not willing to pay. They're willing to kill themselves. They're willing to bring harm to their family and their community even, because of how deeply they believe in their ideas and their commitment to their group and ideology. So we came up with a new term for this called devoted actors. These are people who are willing to commit extreme, costly sacrifices for their cause or their group. And that can include, insurgency groups and terrorist groups, but it can also include people like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. These are people who were willing to give their lives for their cause and for their group. They weren't necessarily willing to take other people's lives, but that's where the ideology of the group comes into play. What is the appropriate costly sacrifice that you can take if you're a devoted actor of this particular movement? So we want to understand a little bit more about that, because the more you understand how a devoted actor actually thinks, how they actually make decisions, you can then start to come up with effective policies. I just want to give you this nice quote that I think nicely summarizes the difference between rational and devoted actors. This is from George Orwell in 1940 when he did a review of Mein Kampf. He said, "Hitler knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice. Whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way have said to people, 'I offer you a good time,' Hitler has said to them, 'I offer you struggle, danger, and death,' and as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet." And I think he's really capturing the spirit over here. People are not just thinking in this, I want to make my life better, I want to improve my well-being sort of a way. They are also wanting to, there's some sort of devotional compulsion in some of us too. We want to sacrifice, and meaning sometimes comes from sacrifice itself. So what are some of the differences between rational and devoted actors? So rational actors, as we said, are motivated by costs and benefits, and so if you can identify someone is thinking in a more rational actor way, you can use carrots and sticks, and it probably will bring about the desired impact. Devoted actors, on the other hand, are motivated by what we call sacred values. These are a subset of moral values that sort of transcend the material. They transcend the profane. They are essentially non-fungible with the profane, which is why things like material incentives and disincentives fail so miserably. We found in multiple studies, including studies we've done in Israel and Palestine, when you offer people a two-state solution, for example, and they hold sacred values over the conflict, incentivizing the deal through things like foreign aid actually makes things worse. It backfires. People are less willing to accept the deal. They're more morally outraged, they're more disgusted by the deal, and more willing to commit violence when you've sweetened the pot of the deal, when you essentially added material incentives to accepting the deal. It's essentially taken as an insult. You have these values that are transcendent, and someone else, the UN or the US or whoever, comes along and says, how about we just buy your sacred values off you? How about we just buy this thing that's so important to you? And obviously that leads to a backfire effect. And that is the standard way a lot of countries try to negotiate conflict. So what does motivate devoted actors? What are the incentives if it's not material incentives and disincentives? We find that social factors are particularly important. So things like social exclusion. So we want to go a little bit further than just doing behavioral studies. So we did the first ever neuroimaging studies. So this took a few years of getting to know members of extremist groups, supporters of extremist groups, and getting them into a brain scanner. So for this first study, were people who were kind of at an early, obviously this is a very intimidating slide, don't worry about it, just, I'll just talk you through it. So basically, we had people who were at a very early stage of jihadist radicalization. We were able to get them into the scanner. We were able to make half of them feel socially excluded and half of them feel socially included. What we found is that, first of all, that essentially there's an area of the brain called the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is associated with sacred values. This is an area that's involved in sort of rule processing, and it can be everything from when you're learning a new language and you're trying to figure out what is the semantic rule I'm supposed to be applying here, all the way to when you're making moral decisions, when you're engaging in deontological moral reasoning, which is saying, what is the moral rule that I'm supposed to apply here? It wouldn't activate, for example, if you were thinking in a utilitarian way about things, if you were thinking in a consequentialist way. There's no calculation, essentially, taking place here. There's no carrots and sticks thinking taking place here, essentially. There is a moral rule that you're applying, and we found that neurally, and we've now replicated this 3 times. We also found that people were more willing to fight and die for their sacred values. What was interesting is we found that when we made half the participants feel socially excluded, now their non-sacred values started to behave like sacred values. That same area of the brain activated for non-sacred values, they increased their willingness to fight and die for their non-sacred values, they started reporting more of their non-sacred values as sacred. So we were able to show now causally, experimentally, that essentially social exclusion pushed, if you will, some of the non-sacred values into the sacred value column, and therefore moved people closer to the edge of violence and made them more devoted actors. So, okay, that's obviously worrying enough. Well, let me just also show you what that looks like in terms of messaging, just because of what date it is today. So let me just go back to January 6, 2021. If you are trying, even if you're a rational actor, which I think Donald Trump is a rational actor, this is how you communicate. This is how you message to devoted actors. This is on January 6th, he put out this tweet. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. I think this is perfect devoted actor messaging. See, first he highlights the sacred value, the sacred landslide election, which is obviously nonsense. And then he manufactures a threat against the sacred value, unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots being these people being devoted actors. And then he highlights the social exclusion to these people who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. So in that one quote, he basically is hitting all the right sort of psychological levers that you would want to if you were trying to communicate to devoted actors, even if you yourself are a rational actor. Okay, so that's concerning enough. That's what pushes people closer to the edge of political violence. What moves them back? So for that, we had to get an even more radicalized population, and for that, I recruited people from supporters and members of Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a terrorist group based in Pakistan. It's an associate of Al-Qaeda. It fights largely on the Kashmir issue. We also got them into the brain scanner, and we had them looking at their sacred and non-sacred values and evaluate their willingness to fight and die for each value. So you see these 2 areas of the brain lit up, the VMPFC there in red and the DLPFC there in green. Imagine you're out in a restaurant and you had a nice meal, and the waiter brings you a menu, and you see a nice tiramisu on that menu, and you go, ooh, I want to eat that tiramisu. That tastes yum. That looks yummy. If I were scanning your brain, I'd probably see the VMPFC active in that moment. That's the part of the brain that activates when you're thinking about what you want, what your desires are, what your subjective values are. But let's say then you stop and you go, you know what, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm trying to lose weight. That seems like a lot of extra calories. If I was scanning your brain in that moment, I would see the DLPFC active. That's sort of executive functions of the brain, emotional regulations, and so forth. And those 2 areas would be communicating with each other, and one would win out over the other. Now, when our Lashkar-e-Taiba members were evaluating their willingness to fight and die for their non-sacred values, you basically see that normal pattern of activity. However, when they're only thinking about their sacred values, that area that's the executive function area basically goes offline. You don't see that active anymore. Now that's concerning when you think about strategic communications, persuasion, negotiation, all of these attempts that try to use language or reasoning or messaging in some way to try to disengage or negotiate or make someone compromise or persuade someone's behavior, the area of the brain that's supposed to be receiving all of that messaging isn't even online to receive it, right? But there's nothing dysfunctional in these people. That area of the brain is perfectly capable of turning online. It turned online for non-sacred values. So of course the question then becomes, how do we get that area back online? How do we get it recommunicating with the VMPFC? Well, we know, again, material incentives don't work, and probably arguing with people and telling them their beliefs are wrong is also not going to be very effective. So again, thinking back in terms of social incentives and disincentives, we used what's called a social norm intervention. We just told them very simply that half the time, the broader Pakistani community, not other Lashkar-e-Taiba members, just the broader Pakistani community, either had the same willingness to fight and die as them or a lower willingness to fight and die as them. So that one was the control condition and one was the experimental condition. And what we found was that when they saw that the broader community had a lower willingness to fight and die for their beliefs, that area of the brain, the DLPFC, came back online. Not only that, when they reevaluated their willingness to fight and die, they reduced their stated willingness to fight and die to conform to the group consensus. Not only that, we could predict how much they were going to reduce their willingness to fight and die just by looking at the DLPFC reactivation alone. Just from that neural evidence, we could predict what their behavior was going to be. And so what that shows is you don't actually need to change people's beliefs, you don't need to actually change their ideas, actually just changing what they think their broader in-groups thinks is an appropriate level of action, is sufficient to lower their violent propensity. Now this connects to the last study I just told you about social exclusion. People only care about the social norms of a group they feel like they belong to. If they don't feel included in that group, if that's an enemy group, if it's one that's excluding them, they're not going to particularly care what the social norms of that group actually is. You only conform because you want to stay a member of that particular group. That identity matters to you, and you see yourself as belonging to it. So the challenge when you bring these two studies together becomes, in the wake of a terrorist attack or anything, there's oftentimes a push for the broader identity group. People tell the broader identity group, you must condemn the most extremist people within your group, you must condemn these individuals. But of course, condemning them can turn into social exclusion. It can simply say, you're not part of our identity, you're not included in our group. And if that's the case, then you're fissuring probably one of the strongest vectors of influence you have over that group. So the goal should always be, how do you, and for any broad identity group, how do you make the most extremist elements within your group still feel included within that identity, while simultaneously creating strong social norms that condemn the violent actions of that group? Because those social norms are only going to have an influence if people feel included. So there's a lot of research I left on the table. We can go into in the Q&A, a lot of stuff, but here's some basic policy and practice implications that come from the broader research on devoted actors. As I said, don't use material carrots and sticks. They backfire, don't socially exclude, they create more antagonistic sacred values. But I just want to put a caveat against imposing your vision of social inclusion. I see this a lot in programmatic efforts where Western people will have their notion of what they think social inclusion looks like, and they'll go to a part of the world and they'll demand, for example, I was doing research in northeast Syria, in Raqqa, where right after ISIS collapsed, there was a push to create these local community councils that were gender balanced, for example. That's a very Western notion of what social inclusion looks like. That was not well received by the local population and actually undermined not only trust, but the legitimacy of those institutions. So you have to be very careful of what social inclusion means to the local population. As I mentioned about social norms already, symbolic concessions. So I mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian study about how material incentives, foreign aid made things worse. There was another condition that made things better, actually, which was the offer of symbolic concessions. Palestinians, I should say this was at a time of relative peace, not like the current situation we have, where the Palestinians would recognize the right of Israel as a state to exist. Israel would recognize the suffering of the Palestinian people at the hands of Israel. When those symbolic concessions were made, people were now willing to actually consider the two-state solution, discuss drop-down, and willingness to commit violence basically dropped almost to zero. So that was the best possible condition. But again, the conditions have to be right socially for even symbolic concessions, because symbolic concessions need to be made by leaders, they have to be sincere, they have to be unequivocal, and they have to be followed up by actions. You look at the current situation in Israel-Palestine, I don't think symbolic concessions make a lot of sense right now. make people with sacred values heard, especially in asymmetric conflicts. Again, Israel-Palestine and other conflicts that you can look at. Giving the more powerful side the opportunity to give their perspective doesn't do much for the powerful side or for the weaker side. However, when you let the weaker side give their opportunity to speak, especially to talk about their sacred values, you not only see that the stronger side in that argument, in that debate, learn something and open up, but you actually see a willingness to now engage on the weaker side as well. And ultimately, your state of being is part of the equation. I'll just make this personal for a second. You know, I ran through this research very quickly. This work came at a huge cost to my own well-being, to my own mental health. I mean, I was almost kidnapped on multiple occasions, death threats. There was a lot of physical danger. I was in physical harm. I put myself through to get to know these individuals, to convince them to get their brain scanned. But I also heard a lot of people's traumas as well, talking to victims, and I think I picked up a lot of vicarious trauma through doing this work, through hearing all the various stories, and in the process of that, I actually had to check myself into a Buddhist monastery for some time to try to see if I could heal some of my own suffering while doing this work. And while I was there, a Buddhist monk tried to listen to me and understand how I was doing my work, and he gave me, I thought, probably one of the most valuable insights. He said, "I think you're showing too much empathy. Instead, maybe try compassion." And I didn't know it at the time, but there's a whole body of neuroscience that actually looks at the difference between empathy and compassion. And empathy turns out to be quite a selfish emotion. We talk about it a lot, but actually empathy activates areas of your brain related to yourself. You're simulating in your own mind what you would feel like if you were to experience the same thing to better understand the other person. That kind of thing leads to burnout. It leads to vicarious trauma. There is a thing called empathetic burnout. Compassion, on the other hand, activates areas related to other people. Essentially, you're wishing well-being on the other person. You're not simulating what the other person is going through internally. And you don't have this thing like compassionate burnout. You don't have that vicarious trauma that gets picked up through it. So I would also encourage us to think more from a place of compassion over empathy, and that's just coming from a personal point of view. And I would say it transformed the way I started doing field work and the interviews and the information I got from people. I became an unwitting practitioner, because after switching to compassion, people didn't want to stop the conversation with me. They would then DM me, email me, call me, wanting to continue, and then some of them even revealed a desire to want to leave their organizations, because I think what happened was compassion created a safe space for them to actually reveal more about themselves and discover more about themselves as a result of it. So that's just my little plug for compassion.
Thanks.